mainly. All right, well, welcome. Good morning to you. And we'll begin here in Deuteronomy 23 this morning for our Sunday school hour. And I think we got through verse 9 conveniently. This is a passage that's talking about those who are excluded from the presence of the Lord, from the assembly. And we did stop right after verse 9. Remember that the specific instructions about the Edomites, the Egyptians, the Moabites, and the Ammonites, right? They were allowed to intermarry. They were not allowed to take wives, they were not allowed to give their daughters as wives necessarily to every nation. But there were only 7 in Israel, 7 nations that they were excluded from taking wives from because they were supposed to have been part of an exterminated nation. And so we have people like Ruth, the Moabitess, right, that is brought into the lineage of the Messiah, into the lineage of King David, by virtue of marrying into Boaz's family, which is totally fine, but someone fathered by an Ammonite or a Moabite was to be excluded from the assembly up to the 10th generation. Specifically, they were not to detest an Edomite. Even though the Edomites had not treated them well, they were not supposed to hate them. They were supposed to let the Lord deal with the Edomites because the Lord had actually given promises, unconditional promises, actually, to Esau, even though the older was prophesied to rule, the younger was prophesied to rule the older. He still was in the beneficiary of an unconditional covenant himself, although not the same one that Jacob got. And so you're not supposed to detest an Egyptian because it was in their land that they became a nation, having been just a family. We say just a family. It was 70-something people. It's a fairly large family. People are surprised by the size of our family. There were 5 of us siblings, and with both my parents were still living. I think there were 38 of us if we all got together for Thanksgiving. So it's not a small family. Even our large family is a small family compared to that, but still it takes some doing to make 70 people into a definable nation, which is what they did in Egypt. All right, so they had specific instructions. The NASB renders verse 10 kind of specifically, and I don't think it's supposed to be that specific. So I'm going to read it from the New King James, because if I read it from Hebrew, you won't understand it anyway, right? Okay, so I'm going to read it in a different translation that's a little less specific. If there is any man among you who becomes unclean by some occurrence in the night, the Hebrew word there is accident, night accident. So the NASB renders that a little more specifically. And so there were specific things that they were supposed to do if that happened. That could be anything, most likely wetting the bed, right? Bill Cosby is not seen in much favor these days, but he has a part of his old bit where he said, "My mama always told me to put on clean underwear in case I was in an accident. I thought that was an accident." But that's the nature, right? So they had specific cleanliness rituals that they were supposed to do. If they had a night accident, any man among you, which, could be by virtue of sickness, illness, if any of y'all have made the dubious decision to brush your teeth with the wrong water while you were traveling in the wrong country, you may have had this problem. So that's what it is. He's supposed to not re-enter the camp until he's bathed himself with water, and at sundown he may re-enter the camp. You shall also have a place outside the camp and go out there, and you shall have a shovel or a spade among your tools, and it shall be when you sit down outside, you shall dig with it and shall turn to cover up your excrement. So the law was very specific, guys. It had all sorts of things, all sorts of guidance for you. This was for everybody. That was to keep the camp clean. I'm not sure exactly why that was necessary. So don't ask me why was it necessary to tell people to dig their latrine outside the camp. Anyway, I'm going to presume we don't have any questions about that part, but I'll let you tell me that. Thaddeus, you keep your hand down. I can see on your face, you, sir, I saw the look on your face. Don't try to stump the dummy here. All right. To be fair, if you look at the municipal code of the city of El Paso, Texas, it's much more detailed than this. So apparently it was also necessary. Yeah, Becky. Yeah. And I'm sure that the municipal code disallows that also, right? Certainly in the cities, but they just don't enforce it. So maybe it's more necessary than we think. Certainly, certain parts of Austin have been like that for a long time, and that's gotten worse. Anyway, they're supposed to keep the camp in a sanctified state. Simply, if for no other reason, then God says, I dwell among your midst. So this is his camp as much as it is theirs. In fact, he says that, verse 14, since Yahweh your God walks in the midst of your camp to deliver you and to defeat your enemies before you, therefore your camp must be holy, and he must not see anything indecent among you, or he will turn away from you. You shall not hand over to his master a slave who has delivered himself or rescued himself from his master to you. This is an interesting caveat, right? That they were allowed to own slaves. They were allowed even to own slaves among their own people. But they weren't allowed to beat their slaves half to death. And that's what the idea here is, that this slave has illegitimate fear for his life, with evidence to show that, and delivered himself, rescued himself. It's a reflexive verb, so he has done this for himself. And so he's not just coming into their midst to be a slave again. Verse 16 says, he shall live with you in your midst, in the place in which he shall choose in one of your towns where it pleases him. You shall not mistreat him. This is something that is missed, I think, in a lot of the historical analyses of what constituted slavery. Everything all right there, Jacob? My phone is away from my body, but it's not that far. I mean, what if I need to tweet something right in the middle of Sunday school? I need to have it at hand, right? All right. Is that better? Okay. I keep it here, actually. I have to tell you, one of the first times I preached at New Braunfels Bible Church, when I had gone to be on staff there, my phone voice activated, and it just kept saying over and over, what would you like me to do? What would you like me to do? What would you like me to do, in the middle of my sermon? And I wouldn't listen when I said it to shut up. You know, it just kept trying to be very polite about it. But so I was like, please flush it down the toilet, do something, but don't let it interrupt my sermon again. So thankfully one of the elders was able to grab it and shut it off. Phones cause all sorts of trouble. All right. So am I still acting funny up here, Jacob? Voice-wise, just a little. Well, there's nothing I can do about it. So we'll just continue. I hope that it's not overly irritating. Is it bothering else? Things bother Jacob that don't bother normal people. Did I say that pointedly enough? He's a little fussy about certain things that most people don't notice. All right. So you're supposed to deliver that person. That person is allowed to deliver himself. And in the historical analysis of slavery, in the history of humanity, that's something that is missed, actually, that all slavery, right, is not considered exclusive of human rights. In other words, somebody can sell themselves into slavery, which was a feature historically in the institution, in order to satisfy a debt. They could do that within the nation of Israel, and their human rights were not violated in doing so. But you were not allowed to violate somebody's human right by nearly killing them, by beating them in any stretch. right? That wasn't the case. And I think I've mentioned that there is a libertarian argument that says that you're actually depriving someone of their human right by not allowing them to settle a debt in this manner. Can you understand how that might be? That I don't have personal sovereignty over myself in order to give the product of my labor, perhaps for a shorter time than a 30-year debt or a 100-year debt or whatever, but I could work full-time for somebody like Israel for 6 years, and then I'm set free. But 100% of my product goes to that person during that time. In other words, don't believe the common narrative that says that all slavery throughout all humanity was a violation absolutely of every human right that ever existed. I don't give much ground on the institution of of plantation slavery, okay, because that was genocidal. Also not entirely the product of Western civilization, by the way. So the onus for that doesn't reside simply on people in this continent, okay? Without present-day slavery exists, and it's not popular to say that, but most of it is produced by Islam. Islam all over Africa continues to practice the slave trade in horrible and terrible ways that are a violation of this principle. All right. But if Africa didn't make the product themselves by tribes enslaving other people, even plantation slavery wouldn't have existed. Anyway, how does that relate to you today? I don't know, but somehow it's Donald Trump's and white supremacy's fault that a black man was beat to death by 5 black police officers recently. So you can turn anything into racism if you're stupid. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
On that verse 15,
Yes.
is it just understood that if the slave left, it was because he was being mistreated? Because there's no clear statement that he gets away from it.
Yeah, the verb there indicates that he is delivering himself from an unlawful treatment, right? So that's a reflexive, that's the same word, Yahweh will save you. He saved himself from assault, essentially, or his enemy. His master was his enemy in this case. So that's where I get that, Angela. Yeah. It is not, this is not simply the Underground Railroad in Israel, right? Where simply if anybody could get to the Underground Railroad, they would escape, which I don't have a problem with them, but that's not what's happening here. Because that kind of arrangement societally was institutionalized and regulated. And so that was the nature of that, okay? Any other questions about that? Because this is kind of a hot button thing, really, the nature of human rights and institutions within a society. And it really is a big stumbling block for people that Yahweh regulated and institutionalized and limited slavery within the nation of Israel rather than just declaring it not to be so, right? And even regulated the possession of your cousin, because these guys are all cousins, even if there were millions of them. They're all descended from the same tribe, same family. All right. So that may hurt your feelings, but that's what it says. All right. Verse 17, none of the daughters of Israel shall be a cult prostitute, nor shall any of the sons of Israel be a cult prostitute. Both types existed in the pagan worship of the day among the peoples that were being exterminated under an extermination mandate in Israel. You need to understand there's a limitation, right, that the daughters of Israel and the sons of Israel within a family, this would be essentially a form of slavery also, in which the production, the wages, would be directed towards the family. Unfortunately, this sort of thing essentially still exists. They're not in a temple somewhere, but people do traffic their own children. You have a lot of people that claim to support human rights today, and that saying that disallowing or discouraging illegal immigration is a violation of human rights. when we have things like last week, I think it was 57 children they found in a semi-trailer coming north from Mexico? 57 unaccompanied children. Now, I'm not a pessimist in my life, but I have a hard time being optimistic about what in the blazes is going on with that bull crap. You think somebody's human rights are getting violated when they put 57 unaccompanied children in the back of a semi-trailer, bringing them south, from the south to the north, across a border illegally? And do you think that there's something in the policies of our country that make that possible and likely and desirable and profitable? So the fact that they're not doing this before a graven image necessarily doesn't mean that they're not violating this principle. I want you to understand, too, that it was terrible. You couldn't justify this by paying a tax. That's what the next verse says. You shall not bring the hire of a harlot or the wages of a dog, which is what they referred to a male cult prostitute as in Israel. That's the dog. That's parallel phrasing there. The harlot is the daughter. The dog is the son of Israel. You shall not bring the hire of either one into the house of Yahweh your God, for any votive offering for both of these are an abomination to Yahweh your God. So we do have a certain component in our society that says that you can basically justify almost anything as long as you tax it, as long as it's producing something for the greater good, and that was not part of God's law and God's nation. You couldn't just tax it into morality, right? So, I think that speaks for itself. I'm not going to focus on that. But you do need to understand that God doesn't make arbitrary laws. He makes laws that are corrective of things that people have already violated. People have already made a moral, ethical, criminal error, and God is now establishing clearly his standard for that behavior, or there is a real risk that his people are going to engage in that behavior, and he prohibits it preemptively and tells them what not to do. All right? So there were things going on like this, or it was a real risk. It was a feature of the economy in most ancient Near Eastern cultures. You shall not charge interest to your countrymen, interest on money, food, or anything that may be loaned at interest. You may be charged interest to a foreigner, but to your countrymen you shall not charge interest, so that Yahweh your God may bless you in all that you undertake in the land which you are about to enter to possess. This is a feature kind of important doctrinally in the history of the church, right? Because this was actually adopted in a very odd way by people who believe that the church has replaced Israel throughout European history, right? They actually had in their economic systems within Europe that they couldn't charge each other interest. So they had to go to the Jews that were dispersed among them in order to have bankers that could be profitable and make money and charge interest, because the Jews were allowed to charge them interest but not other Jews in their own legal system. It was a weird situation because the Jews never gave up their principles, national principles of not charging each other interest during that time. They never agreed with the church that the church had replaced Israel, but both of them were trying to apply the law in their lives. They were not trying to charge each other. I don't know how anybody made money, right? Like, I don't know. But they weren't supposed to do that. Now, remember that the law is for the people in the land. The law is not for the people out of the land, and that was an error on the dispersion Jews, actually. You can't keep the law if you're not in the land. It's impossible. Essentially, in the positive sense, Moses had told this Deuteronomic generation, the second generation, he said, we are not going to do in the land what you're doing now. What you're doing now, essentially, he says, it's a familiar phrase. He says, every man is doing what is right in his own eyes. You're trying to be the best neighbor you can. You're trying to do the best things that you can. We have the covenant for the land, and when we enter the land, this is going to be the law. He doesn't say that as a negative thing, and that's how you're used to hearing it. When you open to the book of Judges, and the book of Judges says that there was no king then, that everyone did what was right in their own eyes, that's a profoundly negative thing, right? But that wasn't seen as negative. The reason it was negative in Judges is because the people were in the land and they had failed to obey and they were doing what was right in their own eyes. They were not availing themselves of the Sinai covenant, the Abrahamic covenant, or the Mosaic covenant. They were doing what was right in their own eyes in the wrong place. So in the land, they were not to charge their countrymen interest. The land was a land of abundance. It was a land of plenty. Everyone who entered the land was going to harvest grapes from vineyards they didn't plant. They were going to plant and harvest from fields they didn't clear. They were going to live in houses they did not build because the Lord was gracious to them. And they didn't need to eke out every single last shekel, I guess you would say, out of their neighbors. They were supposed to be gracious to their neighbor if they were in need. They weren't supposed to, earlier in this chapter or the previous chapter, if they saw an untagged livestock floating around that belonged to their neighbor, they weren't supposed to say, oh, free meat, let me eat this thing. They were supposed to hold on to it and care for it until their neighbor came to claim it. Oddly enough, this has happened to me. You don't think that livestock just show up in your yard. But I have had turkeys and goats, both uninvited, just show up at my fence line. And my neighbors were losing their ever-loving mind because I didn't want to go take those animals and put them into my own yard. But we have literally had an intact buck goat just show up. And for the sake of the children that were playing on the trampoline he decided to hang out under, I went and got the goat. But no neighbor would come and get it. I tried to please come get your goat out of my yard. I guess the girl goats sounded like they wanted a buck goat. Same thing with the turkeys. The female turkeys we had called in a tom. But they were supposed to do that. So eventually we did end up eating all of those animals because I couldn't get a neighbor to come get them after a few months. But again, we're not in the land. We're not Jewish. We're not Israel, right? But that's not what they were supposed to do. They weren't supposed to take every single last chance to take advantage of every single last situation to the furthest extent that they possibly could. I don't know if you've ever had that experience, but that's not how family was supposed to work. I have family members with whom you never feel like you're family. You feel like you're a business opportunity. And that's not how that's supposed to be, even now. Can we say that? That we're not supposed to necessarily take every last single advantage that we possibly could. And I'm all in favor of taking advantage of opportunity. But that wasn't what they were supposed to do. Uh-oh. I've been talking too long and my screen turned off. Can you imagine such a thing? All right, there we go. But he says this, you shall not charge interest to your countrymen, so that Yahweh your God may bless you in all that you undertake in the land which you are about to enter to possess. So in other words, if you want God to be abundantly gracious to you, you need to obey. You need to believe him that this is his design, this is his plan. And do this, and you will be blessed in everything that you do. Verse 21, when you make a vow to Yahweh your God, you shall not delay to pay it, for it would be a sin in you, and Yahweh your God will surely require it of you. However, if you refrain from vowing, it would not be sin in you. We tend to think of this, again, as a principle that only exists under the law, but I would say that the instance of Ananias and Sapphira indicates that this principle actually does exist in the church. Right? The problem wasn't that Ananias had property and sold it and didn't give all the money to the church at the apostles' feet, right? That wasn't the problem. You remember the story? Y'all remember Ananias and Sapphira? Do we need to go look at it? You remember that they carried both of their bodies out of the presence of the apostles? The issue was that they declared a vow having done something. We did this. They wanted to be in the in crowd like the cool kids that all sold the property and gave everything to the apostles. They lied about it. And God says, look, if you make a vow, you need to pay it. You need to do it. But you don't have to make a vow. There are things that you do have to do under the law. There are appearances that you have to make, especially as a Israelite male. Those are required of you, but your vow is not. Verse 23, you shall be careful to perform what goes out from your lips, just as you have voluntarily vowed to Yahweh your God what you have promised. When you enter your neighbor's vineyard, then you may eat grapes until you are fully satisfied, but you shall not put any in your basket. It's cutting it pretty fine, isn't it? You know? You've probably heard over the years about people who found out that an all-you-can-eat buffet at Golden Corral is not technically all-you-can-eat, right? No? You haven't met that? They don't have to-go boxes at Golden Corral, by the way. You're not supposed to pick it up and take it with you. My brothers and I, when we were all in high school, actually made a CC's Pizza manager weep once because it was all you could eat. And we decided that we would determine how much CC's Pizza, in its original form, $2.99 buffet, cardboard pizza, not pizza that I would let pass my lips today, but at 15 or 16. And I think between us, the four of us, we were up over 100 pieces of pizza. At $2.99, all you can eat, with a drink back then. It's pretty easy to put them in the red. But that was kind of the principle, is all you could eat. You could eat your grapes to your fill. I know you've probably driven up Highway 28. Jacob and I ride our motorcycles up there every once in a while. And there you see your signs even. They don't let you even pick pecans up off the street. It's a prosecutable offense. That wasn't supposed to be the way Israel was. If you were walking through a vineyard, or as Jesus did, through the field, right? You remember that the disciples took heads of grain and rubbed them between their hands. Unroasted wheat, yuck. It shouldn't even be digestible, but that's what they ate. And they were allowed to eat their fill. You weren't supposed to take any with you, no to-go boxes, no doggy bags. Same thing, verse 25, when you enter your neighbor's standing grain, then you may pluck the heads with your hand, but you shall not wield a sickle in your neighbor's standing grain. It's quite the image. All right. Imagine driving, in modern days, right, there are hardly any small farms left, but just, whoops, let me drive my combine 40-foot swath at one time through your field and take your grain. Again, there are no arbitrary laws in Israel. There's only things that have already been done that are prohibited, and there are things that you're at risk of doing that are preemptively prohibited. So they had to be told there that was wrong. Any questions about that section? It's kind of yeah.
Josh, on the topic of vows, because it does say when you make a vow to the Lord, is it specifically when somebody makes a vow to God? As
Yeah.
Between two people, hey, I vow to Josh, but not invoking the name.
The way that so it's not a handshake agreement, right? So two ranchers, like I actually have one in play today. The guy I buy hay from, Tammy wants me to repeat the question. What's the nature of the vow? Is Scott's question. Is it between two people like a handshake agreement, or is it to God, or is it invoking the name of Yahweh? I think it took two forms. My handshake agreement is I took 2 goats to trade for 2 rams, and there was a miscommunication, and he only brought 1 ram, and I left him 2 goats, because if I bring it home, I got to feed it, and then I got to go catch it again. Handshake agreement was I'll come back to Vado today and pick up that ram lamb as the trade. I have every expectation that my hay supplier will fulfill his vow, but we didn't stand there and say, may God strike me dead if I don't complete this livestock exchange. So that would be different, right? This is not a handshake agreement, but it could also be simply, I am vowing that I will bring 60 ephods, not ephod is a cloth, ephah is a measure of grain as a free will offering to the Levites. That would be a foolish thing to say outside of the land, but in the land you could say, I'm supposed to get 30, 60, 100-fold, right? I'm supposed to obey. God is going to bless me with abundance. And what you have vowed to the Levites would be secured by something that you promised to Yahweh. So I think you could make a handshake agreement. You can make a promise that didn't fit this situation. Because he says you can still do business with somebody. You can still make an agreement without making a voluntary vow. Yeah, so you could make one that you vowed before the Lord, I guess, invoking his name. But frequently when they did that, it wasn't, I'm going to bring this or this. It's, I'm going to do this. May God strike me dead. And actually, you'll notice here, if you don't do it, the Lord your God will surely require it of you. It's a little bit more severe when I say, may God strike me dead if I don't do this. He may take 6 ephahs of grain out of my barn somehow or other, but he may also require my life of me. So that's the caution. You don't have to do that. God has promised you life and not death. He has promised you abundance, so you don't need to use his name like that. But if you choose to do it, make sure you do it right. Make sense, everybody? Okay. Any other questions, comments, accusations of heresy? Instances of replacement theology? No? Good. All right. Because we're talking about the law for Israel, right? This is not law for us. We do want to understand the nature of God's character that's reflected here. And that is taught throughout the Old Testament, God's faithfulness to his promises. And that is in things like this. The Lord will surely require it of you. Because when you invoke the Lord's name and his character is perfect. And he keeps his promises. So that's important. So here we have it. We'll go ahead and go on into chapter 24 because we got 10 minutes or so. So chapter 24 says, the heading here says the laws of divorce. We've already talked a little bit about that divorce was allowed. It was allowed virtually for any reason, which essentially we have now in the United States, right? You can assign fault, but divorce doesn't have to have a fault like it did for a long time. It still comes into play. With custody, and financial considerations. But you're going to get divorced no matter what, even if as long as you want to get divorced, you can get divorced, right? So there is some difference here, right? And the thing that we've talked about in recent weeks is when divorce was disallowed, right? When somebody made a false accusation against his wife about infidelity prior to marriage, and it was proven wrong, that man had lost his privilege, lost his right to divorce his wife ever again, regardless of how she behaved, regardless of how mean she was, regardless of how disrespectful she became in her old age. All of the things that could possibly happen because he made that false accusation against her fidelity and was proven wrong, he lost the ability to do what we're talking about in this chapter. All right? When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes, or if, conditional, that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her. And he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out from his house. And she leaves his house and goes and becomes another man's wife. And if the latter husband turns against her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband dies who took her to be his wife, then her former husband who sent her away is not allowed to take her again to be his wife, since she has been defiled. For that is an abomination before Yahweh, and you shall not bring sin on the land which Yahweh your God gives you as an inheritance. Everybody understand what's happening here? The specific scenario. So this lady is not lucky in love, right? Her husband, first husband divorces her. She goes and marries another husband who may divorce her, or he may die. That happened. Dangerous to be a man specifically in an agricultural, agrarian society. So frequently widows were made. That could happen. But the first husband is not allowed to take her back as his wife in the nation of Israel. Specifically because of the reason he sent her away. He claimed that there was some indecency found in her and sent her out from his house. So why is that an issue for us? Like, why should we even talk about this? Because that's not the law of the land that we live in, is it? Right? It's not the law of the land that we live in. We're not Israel. We don't even live in proximity to the promised land, right? We don't. So it's not even relevant specifically to our neighbors. But even in my tenure here at El Paso Bible Church, I have had people come to me, not specifically with a situation that they were dealing with, but they had family members even that were making YouTube videos. Let not many of you become teachers, friends. That's what Scripture says. Let not many of you become teachers, because as such you will incur a stricter condemnation. YouTube is full of this kind of garbage. And it's often a Sabbatarian, somebody who thinks that we can fix all the problems in our local churches by simply moving our worship services to Saturday morning. That fix everything? I mean, I'm willing to do it if it'll fix everything, but I just don't see that it's going to do it, right? So people like this will sometimes say, that the only way that God is going to bless your marriage is if you go back to your first husband. Because of this, that couldn't have happened even in Israel, right? So say somebody, they were telling people that may have been on wife number 4. I have relatives that finally got tired of getting divorces. And so they got to wife number 4, I think it is. And they're just tired, so I think they stayed. It's not that that happens. And somebody like this will tell them, well, actually, God is not going to bless your marriage unless you go through as many other destructions of relationships as possible to go back to your initial marriage. And that's the only way that God is going to bless your matrimonial union. No matter what age, no matter how many years have passed, this is real, folks. It's not just a singular oddball incident. They need to read the Bible. Actually, because what they're saying is that you need to follow the Mosaic law in regards to your marriage, and the Mosaic law does not even teach that that's possible. That was disallowed entirely. So even if you want to bring the Mosaic law into the church, you got to not be stupid about it. You actually got to read the thing. It wouldn't allow that. That's not how that worked in Israel. And it was a perversion in the land. It was a corruption. It was a sin. It was not just simply a pragmatic thing. God said not to do it. All right? So if you hear that garbage, maybe you're not going to remember that it's Deuteronomy 24, 1-4, but know that the Bible disallowed that for Israel. So even if you think you are Israel, that's not a biblical principle. Of course, if you think you are Israel, you need to read the Bible more, not just in Deuteronomy. All right. When a man takes a new wife, this one everybody remembers, he shall not go out with the army, nor be charged with any duty. He shall be free at home 1 year, and shall give happiness to his wife whom he has taken. Yeah. By the way, they fully expected back then to have a baby in that first year. People act like you're an absolute nutcase if you have a baby in the first year of your marriage. Thousands of years of human experience seem to indicate that's pretty normal. I don't know. A former nutcase standing before you. That's all right. So, they were supposed to do there, be productive in the land, and make sure, quite honestly, that the wife was taken care of in the ultimate sense, if the husband was killed due to his duty in the army. So everybody was conscripted. All right, we got, how many minutes do we got? 3 minutes. Well, I don't know. Should we keep, I guess we could keep going for a few minutes. How important is a couple extra minutes of donut time? That's the real question. No? It's not that important, is it? The Bible's more important than donut time. All right. Not for Isaac, but we're not looking at Isaac. All right. No one shall take a hand mill or an upper millstone in pledge, for he would be taking a life in pledge. Basically, bread was the staple item for anybody, rich and poor, actually. Even most of the monarchs would have eaten mostly bread, except for special occasions. And the way that they operated, they actually ground normally. We found these, archaeologically, it wasn't necessarily the only thing, but they would actually carve out the bottom part of the mill. So that wasn't movable. And then they would fit the upper millstone to fit it. And that was how they ground grain. It was not like the molcajete that they use in Mexico this way, or you can see the Native Americans had dishes, and they would use a round stone, do like that. It was a rotating device, rotated around the center, and you pour grain in the middle. Fairly advanced, actually. Very valuable, also. And they weren't allowed to do that because you would be taking somebody's provision for their own food away. One of those things that you shouldn't eat, really. It may just be modern forms, because as I mentioned, people were allowed to go into the grain fields and rub the heads of grain and eat their fill. But at least what I presume, I mean, grain is supposed to be ground for human consumption. You can't really digest grain. People have a hard time digesting wheat in its modern form anyway. Beans the same way, and there's so much phytic acid in it, it'll just be like a rock in your stomach unless you break it down and cook the fool out of it. And so it had to be ground. So you weren't allowed to do that. Any questions? You weren't supposed to mistreat your countrymen. You weren't supposed to mistreat your cousin. If a man is caught kidnapping any of his countrymen of the sons of Israel, and he deals with him violently or sells him, then that thief shall die. So you shall purge the evil from among you. Human trafficking was not permitted in the nation of Israel, because God does not allow his character to be denigrated, defamed in that way. So again, you live in a border town in which many people will justify 57 children being brought unaccompanied across the border and say that it's God's work, that they're just seeking a better life. That is a deception, a lie, and I probably can't say what it is on video. Probably get in more trouble. People under God's law in God's land among God's people, that was considered a capital crime. And I doubt that the driver of that truck will even spend more than a couple of nights in custody. I know they don't here, because we found similar things on this side of the border. In places like, you have relatives that live in Houston. Isabel has relatives that lives in the Houston area, and they probably think that we live in a jungle out here in the Wild West, where, but actually the human trafficking centers are not El Paso. They're Dallas and Houston and San Antonio. Have much higher rates of this kind of violence being perpetrated. God's character considers that worthy of a capital crime for you to take that. So we need to at least consider it not God's work, right? We need to not tolerate people who say that you are not a good Christian if you don't support human trafficking. They won't call it human trafficking, but that's what I've been told, that Jesus would support human trafficking. That I don't love Jesus if I don't support illegal immigration that's going to destroy people's lives and literally selling them into slavery. That's a load of crap. And on that note, let's pray. Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for your word. We thank you for your character reflected in your law for your people and your land. And we thank you for the lessons that it teaches us and the applications that need to be made to our present experience, even though we know that judicially and governmentally we are not existing in a theocracy. We're not existing under your appointed human priesthood or under your ministry of your king or your prophet directly in our governmental institutions. But Father, we do understand that your character informs the choices that we make and that we are accountable for the choices that we make in regards to those things, according to your character as your children. And Father, we thank you for the truth of those things. Yeah. And it's in your Son's name we pray. Amen.